100 ohms. What is the net reactance of the line? Well, just remember that capacitive reactance and inductive reactance are literally and figuratively polar opposites of each other. So if we had inductive reactance of 600 and capacitive reactance of 200, then essentially the 200 megawatts of capacitive reactance would just subtract from the inductive reactance. So it's XPEL minus XC equals 600 minus 200 equals 400. And you would have 400 ohms of reactance. And as a matter of fact, it's going to be 400 ohms of inductive reactance. The correct answer for that one would be Bravo, or 400 ohms. Questions on that one? All right, let's look at this one. On the transmission line that flows station Alpha to station Bravo is open and unable to close due to excessively high voltage at station Bravo. What device can the system operator use at station Alpha to mitigate this problem? And you've got a number of options there. The key to this one is, one, I'll start by saying this question probably needs to be worded better. And there's, I think Andy had already responded to this on an email, but it's a good one to point out. Hopefully you won't see a question worded exactly like this on the NERC exam. In most all cases, when you're dealing with this situation, the problem area that they're going to be referring to is the voltage level at that location, not on that receiving end bus, or on that open end, the bus at the open end. Even though it says due to excessively high voltage at station Bravo. For me, that reads, if it's at station Bravo, I'm thinking it's going to be that bus. But the question, the intent of the question was here at that location. Okay, so again, not much you can do about a poorly worded question, but let's look at it from both standpoints. Okay, if we're talking about
no, you can't.
voltage at that location, what could you do? Okay, so now we're looking at doing something over here at station Alpha when we've got high voltage at that location. Okay, so let's look at the answer options. If we insert a shunt capacitor over here at station Alpha, that's going to raise this bus voltage. It's going to raise the voltage that we're starting with here. It's going to make this voltage even higher. Okay, so, and what we're talking about is trying to close this breaker, and sync check relays won't let us close because there's too much of a voltage difference on either side of the breaker. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. So if we put a cap bank in over here at Alpha, that's just going to make the problem worse. Okay, so that wouldn't be a correct answer for that. If we inserted a series capacitor, so let's say if we did have a series capacitor on this transmission line, the purpose of the series capacitors are to make the line look like a shorter line, which in this case, it seems a little counterintuitive. If a shunt capacitor hurts, it turns out a series capacitor actually helps because it makes it look like a shorter line. Well, the reason why we have high voltage here is due to the Ferranti effect. The Ferranti effect is a function of line length. Okay, so the longer the line is, the worse the Ferranti effect is going to be. If we put a series capacitor in service, it makes it look like a shorter line electrically, which makes the Ferranti effect less. So in that case, that would be effective. Okay. Let's look at our other options. Insert a shunt reactor. If we inserted a shunt reactor over here, then that would lower the voltage on this bus, which would lower the voltage that we started with, and that one would help as well. Okay, so in that case, Bravo and Charlie would both be effective. Bypass a series capacitor. In other words, most of these series capacitors, the way you put them in and out of service is they have another breaker. So if you close that breaker and take that series capacitor out of service, it's not going to help. It actually would make the problem worse. So for this particular question, again, we've got insert a series capacitor, which would help. If we inserted a shunt reactor, that would help because that would absorb megavars and lower this bus voltage. So for this one, either Bravo or Charlie. Okay. Which one was the correct answer on the answer key? I don't know. So I'm not going to point out for sure which one of those is the right answer. Hopefully you would not see this question on the NERC exam. Okay, so let's look at it now from the standpoint of, let's say it is high voltage on that bus. And what could we do over here at alpha that would help? Okay, so if the voltage is high here, now we're going to have to do something. If we're doing something over here at station alpha, we're going to have to do something to raise the voltage here to match whatever it is on that bus. So if we inserted a shunt capacitor over here, we'll put a cap bank in service, then yes, that would raise this bus voltage. That would increase the voltage over here as well. So in that case, that would help. It's basically going to be the opposite of everything we just looked at. So if we insert a series capacitor, that would lower that voltage. That would make the difference across that breaker even worse. So that wouldn't help. Inserting a shunt reactor, again, that would lower this voltage, which would lower this and make the problem worse. And bypassing a series capacitor, and in that case, we would make the line look like it was a longer line, which would raise this voltage a little bit. So that would help. So in that case, alpha and delta both would be possible correct answers. So again, I really don't like this particular question. Not worded that well and a little bit confusing. That's the reason I'm not going to say which one's the right answer for this particular question. Hopefully you won't see this one on the NERC exam, but it does give us an opportunity to talk about these different voltage devices and how Ferrante effect works and what you can do to mitigate. Any questions on that one? All right. Look at this one. Another one that's not worded. The question itself is worded okay, but the answer options are not that great. So balancing authorities in EEA level 1, which means they're concerned about maintaining their contingency reserves. What must the balancing authority do prior to moving to the next EEA level? Okay, so one of the things that we highly recommend on the NERC exam, since they're all 4 option multiple choice questions, the process of elimination helps sometimes. So on this one, we'll use some of that. So first answer option, inform the transmission operator and reliability coordinator. Reliability coordinator maybe, but not the transmission operator. There's nothing in the standards anywhere about the BA having to notify the transmission operator in relation to capacity energy emergencies. Okay, so that one kind of rules this one out. I'm going to hold on to that and we'll come back to it. These last 2 answer options, and this is prior to moving to the next EEA level. Shed non-firm load. No, if you're shedding non-firm load, or ensure that you're going to shed all non-firm load prior to moving to EEA2, no. That's not what you would do as part of an EEA1 process, is shedding non-firm load. Same thing here. Sure, operating reserves are in place, which you would want to make sure that you had your operating reserves. If you didn't have your operating reserves, then you would be going to an EEA level 3. Okay. Purchases are scheduled. Yeah, you're going to be trying to buy everything you could, but again, shedding non-firm load, no, that's not something you would do before you went into an EEA2. So I'm going to scratch through both of those just because of that shedding non-firm load, which leaves us with answer Bravo, which I'm pretty good with some of this. Ensure operating reserves are in place. Yeah. Additional transactions, purchases are scheduled. Yeah, I mean, you'd be wanting to buy what you could. And all available generation. And the real sticker for me is this, making sure that generation is online. Not something you would want to do is to make sure that all your generators are online before you went to an EA2. You're going to have some generation available, but you don't have to have it online before you go to an EEA level 2. So for this one, of those, answer option B is the best one, but I don't necessarily agree with that last statement about having all generation available online. Hopefully you don't see a question like that on the NERC exam, but I will say this, I took the RC exam about this time last year. I did see a couple of questions that I did not like. I didn't like the way they were worded. I didn't like the answer options or something. And there is an option to make a comment on there. Hopefully it was one of the pilot questions that was on the exam. Any questions or comments on that one? For the most part, though, the NERC exam questions are good. All right, let's look at this one. After the winter morning peak, in other words, which by the way, this is kind of what a typical summertime load profile looks like. This may be 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, around 1700 in the afternoon. So you typically have a profile that looks like that. Wintertime load profiles, they can vary a lot, but a lot of times you're going to have a morning peak and then an afternoon peak, and a lot of times it looks something like that. So you wind up with a morning peak and an afternoon peak, and some variation of that. So what this is referring to is essentially you've had sometime after the morning peak on a wintertime morning, so your load's dropping off. You've got CTs are base loaded and unable to decrease. So some of our generation resources have basically a range that they can operate in. So you've ramped your CTs down to their minimum levels, and they're unable to decrease the output any further. And other units are unable to regulate any lower. So you've got everything regulated down. Your nuclear units are loaded and solar's starting to pick up, which is what happens. That's usually what drives this load to drop. As sun comes out, load starts dropping off. ACE is trending up because load's dropping. You got increased solar generation. You've got no regulation. What do? Well, of these options, take your CTs offline, which by the way is the correct answer. The reasons why you can't do these others: increase interchange out. Well, it'd be nice if you could sell it, but that assumes you got a buyer, and that's the problem. You can't guarantee that you're always going to have a buyer, because if you're dealing with this, guess what? Pretty much every other balancing area, at least in the region, and probably everyone on the interconnection is dealing with the same thing you're dealing with, and they're not going to be wanting to buy megawatts. So not an option, certainly not a guaranteed option. Curtail solar. Well, just the way we do things, when you, especially cost really doesn't come into the equation, but when you're looking at how we typically operate the power system, you're going to either take your CTs offline or curtail solar. You're going to take your CTs offline before you would curtail the solar output. That's just the way we operate the power system. Consider available spending reserves and replace resources planned for the day. That's just a distracting type. Not really come into play on that. Okay. So the correct answer to that one's going to be, yeah, you just take your CTs offline, which is a good thing about CTs. Very, very low restart cost on CTs. And we do that a lot in the wintertime. We'll pick up these CTs to handle that morning peak, and then we'll shut them off after the morning peak and possibly crank them back up that afternoon. Questions or comments on that one?
Yeah, I have a question. So when I was reading this, I assumed that the CTs, since it says they're base loaded, they were like serving just like, you know, the basic load needs. And so in my mind, you couldn't take them off because you don't know like how much like megawatts your nuclear units had to support your load. You know what I'm saying?
Well, the thing of it is yeah, and I understand what you're saying. The terminology that they use there, I guess, can be a little bit confusing. When we say we've got something base loaded, it's basically it's static. It's not going. You can have something base loaded at minimums, or you can have it base loaded at maximum, which is typically where our nuclear units are at. Nuclear unit, we consider them base load, but they're base loaded at maximum. That terminology of base loaded essentially means that they're static. In other words, we've ramped them down. We're unable to ramp them down any further, just like all the other units are unable to regulate any lower. It simply means they're ramped down to their minimum. We've got more than enough generation to supply our load because ACE is trending up. So that tells us we've got enough generation. Actually, we've got more generation than we need because ACE is trending up. So we've got more generation than we need to supply the load. We've just got to get rid of some generation somewhere. And CTs are very flexible in that respect, as far as being able to take them offline and then bring them back on a little bit later.
Yeah, thanks for clearing that up. I think I was just confused on the definition of base loaded. But okay. You cleared it up. Thank you.
And this next one, Balancing Authority Alpha is importing megawatts and has tie line flowing into them when the meter fails to zero. Which of the following statements is true? Easiest way to answer that is, let's just look at an ACE calculation. And we can just make up numbers and do this. Okay, so net interchange actual minus net interchange schedule. And since we're not, if you think about it, I had to comment, or was sharing anything. Can everybody else see my screen? I'm showing I'm sharing. I just had a question. Yeah. Somebody. Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure what's going on, why you can't see it, but yes, I am sharing some. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. We're importing megawatts and the meter fails. Are we still getting those megawatts coming into our system? The answer is yes. We just had a meter fail, whether the meter itself failed or the communication channel to that meter failed. We're just not seeing that data, but we're actually still getting the megawatts. So if nothing changed from that standpoint, is frequency going to change? Not just as a direct result of the meter failure, the frequency is not going to change. So we had a couple of responses here about Balancing Authority's frequency will drop. No. And that's another clue too. It says the Balancing Authority's frequency will drop. Well, frequency is an interconnection-wide measurement. So that's another clue that that's not going to be a correct answer. Balancing Authority's frequency will increase. Okay, so I'm going to basically eliminate those. Really what the question is asking is, how is that going to impact your ACE? Okay, so we can just make up some numbers and plug in there. Let's say we're importing, so I want to say 100 megawatts. So that would be 100 megawatts minus 100 megawatts for a schedule. Question is what happens if that goes to zero? Okay, so the meter failed, our net interchange actual goes to zero, because that's where we get that net interchange actual value from, is from those meters. So it went to zero. Now we've got 0 minus a negative 100, which equals 100 or a positive 100. Oh, excuse me. So our ACE would go to a positive 100. So now we can eliminate that one. And let's see if this one sounds right. Balancing authority generators on AGC will decrease output, which they would do if your ACE indicated a positive, then your units on AGC will start to decrease output. So essentially, if you're importing megawatts, that ACE value and the meter fails, then your ACE is going to go positive.
I was going to say one specifically, but
Question or comments on that?
I can say yeah. Just all around.
Look at the next one, which is essentially same type of question. Yeah, and Andrew said that would be a bad thing because ACE is actually 0. You're right. It would be a bad thing. Let's look at this other option here. Balancing authority has tie line meter failed to 0 on a line that is exporting 200 megawatts. Well, if it went positive, if you were importing megawatts, what would it do if you were exporting? Well, essentially it's going to go the opposite direction. So in this case, your ACE would go to a negative, or it would go negative by 200 megawatts. So the answer options are a little different here. Okay, we'll scratch through the frequency one, and or so that the ACE is going to go negative. If it goes negative, your generators are not going to decrease output, they're actually going to increase, which leaves that one as the correct answer. Okay, well, we have to look at something different to verify that that's the correct answer. Okay, so what we have to know there is that your load on your system, every control center I've ever been in, somewhere prominently displayed is what the load is in your system. That is not a value that we measure. That is a value that is calculated, and it's calculated based off of total generation minus your net interchange actual value. So we do measure our total generation. We measure all of our generation outputs, and then we subtract our net interchange actual, and that tells us what our load is. Well, if that value changed, then it's going to show a change in load. So, and in this case, when it changed like that, it will make it look like our total demand indication would increase. Questions or comments on that? And just kind of reinforce what Andrew said about that would be a bad thing because ACE is actually 0. Yes. And speaking from experience, what will wake up a balancing authority at 3 o'clock in the morning is if you're exporting about 1,200 megawatts and you have a meter failure. And now your ACE instantly goes to minus 1,200 megawatts, which happens to line up pretty close with several megawatt outputs of generator units that you have in your footprint. And your first thought is, uh-oh, I just lost one of my large generators, which is why we train all of our balancing authorities to validate what caused that ACE value to go negative before you respond to it. You may have lost a large generator, or you may have just had a meter that failed. And what you don't want to do is start 1,200 megawatts of fast start CTs simply because you had a meter failure. Questions or comments on that? All right, this next one was based off of that. Okay, so pretty sure that's a question in one of our test sets somewhere. I don't remember now. It's probably the online training, and it's something that I've talked with Andy about. We need to revise that. This is one of the most often misunderstood concepts. Okay, so I went to EPRI manual and pulled out a couple of graphs, and I think I know where most of the misunderstanding comes from on this. Okay, so this is straight out of the EPRI manual. And if you look at this question up here, and it says the distance along the line. So it's basically it's wanting to look at the voltage profile due to the Ferrante effect on a transmission line. And here we see that that dotted red line there represents the voltage profile. And of these up here, which one most closely represents that is this one, is where you get most of your voltage increase, or you get a lot quicker voltage increase early in the line, and then it kind of flattens out here towards the end. So of these, really, it's hard to read those. I think that's actually 3, which is the one that most closely represents that. And this has shown up on the NERC exam. Okay, so just know that you're going to get a quicker voltage increase early in the line, and then it kind of flattens out. I think this is where some of the confusion comes from, is this graph. And we're still talking about Ferrante rise, but this is just showing you how the length of the line impacts that Ferrante rise. So basically for a 100-mile long line, you may get a 2% rise. If it's a 200-mile long line, you may get an 8.8% rise. And the longer the line is, the more impactful that is. But this is not showing the voltage profile along the length of the line. Okay, so that one does show that voltage profile along the length of the line. Okay, so just make sure you understand the differences between those two graphs. Questions or comments on that?
Hey, Kelly, can you
Yes.
work through that curve 3 compared to the figure 518 again? Where it rises really quick at the front end and then kind of tapers off. Where
Yeah.
figure 518 shows an exponential increase as length increases. It looks like the inverse.
Not. This is not showing the voltage profile along the line. This is showing you for a 100-mile long line, you're going to get about a 2% increase. But if you looked at, and let's just use this 300 because it's going to be easier to draw.
This won't have energy.
This is showing you for a 300-mile long line, you would get a 22% increase.
No,
But if you looked at the voltage profile along the length of that line, it's going to look something like that. And the peak voltage increase is going to be about 22% for a 300-mile long line. But if you look at the voltage profile along the line, you're going to get a lot of increase early in the line, and then it kind of flattens out towards the end of the line. Same thing for, say, maybe a 200-mile long line. You get a lot of that increase early, and then it kind of flattens out towards the end. If you're looking at the voltage profile along the line, what this graph is showing here is just for different lengths of lines, you wind up getting a larger peak voltage at the very end of the line. And it does rise exponentially for longer line lengths. That peak voltage that you'll see does increase exponentially, but it's not showing what the voltage profile is along the line. This shows you what that voltage profile looks like.
Thanks, Kelly. That answers that question.
Yeah. And I think Victor pointed out, yeah, the correct answer in the answer key is highlighted as number 2, but it's not the correct answer for what you would see on the NERC exam. So just be aware that that's one that needs to be corrected. And actually that number 3 trend, it's not terribly accurate. It doesn't align excuse me, it doesn't line up with what's shown here either, so. And Andrew, I just now saw your comment about how would you know if it's a meter failure? There are other things that you can look at, or other things that BAs have to look at. One is, most of the time we trend generation outputs, especially our large generators. We have trends that we can look at to make sure that they're still trending and you don't see a drop off on those. Where I used to work at, that was one of the prominent displays that the BAs had, was a trend of those large generators. So it was one of the first places we were trying to look. If you had a rapid change in ACE, well, look at that and you can look at those trend lines and see if one of them changed really rapidly. Also, we could trend our tie line flows. So, you just glance at those, especially if one of them shows 0 and it shouldn't, then yeah, that's where we would look really quick to validate if it was actually 0 or if that's just a meter failure. We actually had like a 1-page quick reference checklist of things to go through to validate a rapid ACE change. All right, any other questions on this? So I apologize for that being kind of misleading, or actually it's not a good test, or not a good question. We need to update that one and correct it. Let's look at this one. Had lines 1, 2, and transformer bank 1 all tripped during a storm. Line 1 must be restored before line 2. What must the TOP ensure? And I'm kind of going to start from the bottom and work my way up. I mean, this one's highlighted as being the correct answer. And one of them is frequency is at target. Well, I'm not sure why they even have frequency is at target as an answer option for this question, because frequency is something that the balancing authority deals with. It's not a transmission operator issue unless we're dealing with system restoration. And even then, it's, what frequency is going to be irrelevant to this unless we were islanded and we were trying to synchronize 2 islands, which, yeah, it says trip during a storm, but it doesn't say anything about being islanded. So frequency really should be irrelevant at this point, and especially frequency at target should not have any bearing on putting this line back in service. Reactor on line 1 is in service to reduce open-end voltage. Well, again, didn't say anything about there being a voltage problem. If it did give us some specifics that we had too much of a voltage difference to close that breaker to put line 1 in service, then maybe, but it really didn't say anything at all about having a voltage issue. Line 3 is not above system operating limit. If line 3 was above system operating limit, then getting line 1 and 2 back in service is actually going to help that. And if it was above the SOL, that's certainly not going to be preventing us from putting line 1 in service. That's actually going to help the situation. The sooner we can get everything back together, it's going to help the loading on line 3. So of these answer options, there's not a large power angle between bus A and bus B. Okay, that's what's going to prevent us from putting that line back in service. If there is a large power angle, that would definitely prevent us from closing that breaker or putting that line back in service. So of those answer options, that is definitely the best answer option. It's just to make sure there's not a large power angle, because if there was, that would definitely prevent us from closing that breaker. Questions or comments on that one? All right, let's look at, well, that was all of them I had by email. I had a couple of them come in on chat, and I'm going to go back up and Try to make sure I catch these in order.
Yeah.
Okay. The Bouncing 30 Charlie's purchased 600 megawatts of power from Bouncing 30 Alpha. When a high voltage transmission line trips between Alpha and Charlie, 70% of the power flows through Bravo. Low voltage becomes a serious problem for Bravo, who requests immediate assistance from the reliability coordinator. What should the reliability coordinator consider? Okay, so I'm going to try to draw this out. So here is Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. Okay, so Charlie has about 600 megawatts from Alpha, 600 megawatts of flow from Alpha to Charlie. When a high voltage transmission line trips between Alpha and Charlie, so we lost that one, 70% of that power flows through Bravo. Low voltage becomes a serious problem for Bravo. So we've got low voltage here. We request immediate assistance from the reliability coordinator. What should the reliability coordinator consider? Shedding load in area A. Well, we've got large megawatts flowing through there. Okay, that's causing a low voltage in that area. So if we shed load in Alpha, that's just going to make the problem worse. You're going to wind up with more power flow. So I know that one's not the answer. Shed load in area Bravo, possibly. That would unload some of the flow on that line. Shedding load in area C looks to be a better option, because if we shed load in areas Charlie, then that's going to unload this line and this line. And so that's a possible and issue an EEA. Well, energy emergency alert that deals with capacity and energy emergencies, that's not going to have any effect at all. Okay, so we don't even know that we have any sort of EEA. So I'm going to scratch through that one. So it boils down to shedding load in area Bravo or shedding load in area Charlie. And of those, if we shed load in area Charlie, that's going to unload this transmission line some and that transmission line, which would give us more relief from a voltage standpoint for Bravo. So that one is going to be the better option of those listed. Questions or comments on that one? Okay, going down through, looking at the chats. Okay, here's one. Okay, so after the morning peak, solar starts to ramp online. Load is lower than expected as temperatures are warmer than forecasted. All baseline coal units are at minimum load and frequency is rising. What do you do? Okay, so essentially here's what we're looking at. After the morning peak, loads are starting to drop and load is actually less than expected, which means, you know, this is down here. Maybe this was our forecast to be here, but we're down here, which means we've got even lower loads than what we had planned on. Coal units are at minimum load and frequency is rising. Speaking from experience as a BA, that's not a pleasant place to be because I've been there before. Trip coal-fired base-loaded units, that's an option. Public appeal to increase load, not an option. EEA declaration, nope, because EEA declaration deals with
Yes.
more load than you do generation, and this is right the opposite. And lastly is take solar offline. So now that we've got these two, I hope we don't have a question like that on the NERC exam. The reason I'm saying that is in some cases, but not all, we have the contractual ability to curtail solar. And strictly from an economic perspective, that would be preferable over taking the coal-fired units off. So for this one, I'm going to say more than likely the correct answer is going to be to curtail the solar output. In most cases, we do have contractual agreements with solar to do that. That would be the preferred option to take, is to take the solar offline as opposed to taking the coal-fired units offline. I know that's different response from what we saw earlier, where we were talking about the combustion turbines, where we would take the combustion turbines offline. Well, I'm not sure if solar was even an option on that other question. I think it was.
I get out in like an hour and a half.
And it's something I really wish the industry would kind of standardize on. So in the previous question, we would take the CTs off, but leave solar on. This one would curtail the solar, but leave the coal-fired base units on. There's a number of factors that go into that. Economics is one of them. Restart cost on coal-fired units are usually really high. From a reliability standpoint, it's better to do the solar than the coal-fired, because a lot of coal-fired units, if you take them off here, when this load's dropping and you're going to have an afternoon peak, chances are they're not going to be able to come back up to help support that afternoon peak. A lot of coal-fired units, we just don't do a really good job of being able to turn those around.
2 years ago.
Most companies don't do a really good job of turning those coal-fired units around quick. So for this, I'm going to say Delta is the correct answer for this one. Questions or comments on that one?
Quick comment. Is it the steam cycle on the coal-fired units that weighs into that? It doesn't like to come off load and get loaded really quick versus the solar, which is a little bit easier to take online and put online.
Oh yeah, the solar's just a matter of basically taking them off, and then as long as the sun's still shining, you can just put them right back on. Yeah, there's a number of issues with the coal plants, and now I'm not an expert on the coal-fired generation and boiler process and all that. There are issues with thermal cycling on the boilers. I know they really don't like to do the quick thermal cycling on those, just because of tube leak issues. That, and from what I understand, there's some other things that prevent them from just doing a quick turnaround if you shut them off. But I think that's the main thing, is just the thermal cycling on the boiler and how impactful that is from a tube leak perspective.
Yeah, and I was like, but it was in the, like, between the glass door and the wood door.
Okay, so let's look at this.
He was trying to come inside.
System operating limit for Bravo to Sigma.
New part, man.
Okay, so here's, I'm just looking at getting my bearings here. So here's Sigma station. System operating limit for Bravo to Sigma, so that's going to be here, is 1250 MVA. Would you allow this planned outage to proceed? Okay, so let me figure out what we got going on. Okay, so I'm just trying to figure out, I'm guessing that this is the planned outage that they were talking about. Yes, and it showed that we would have basically 1,028 megawatts on that line if we did this outage, because that's the only outage I can see that they would be referring to. Strictly from a system operating limit standpoint, then I would say, yeah, you would. From a company specific standpoint, you may have company specific procedures that would say, if this is going to load up to, 80% or greater or 90% or greater of the SOL, then you wouldn't approve it. But that would be a company specific procedure. But from one, you're not going to see this question on the NERC exam. Two, from a reliability standpoint, yes, unless we have to take into account reactive power flow, and in that case, we're not given enough detail to tell for sure how much reactive we would have on each individual line without doing a bunch of calculations. So for this one, I would say strictly from a NERC standpoint, sure, because you're going to be below your well, wait a second. So it is specified in MVA, that's in megawatts. They do give you some megabars, but you'd have to do a ton of calculations to figure out how many megabars, unless you just looks like you've probably got less impedance on this line than you do on the other two. So that would probably impact.
Hey, Kelly, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. What I was trying to understand is how do you figure that it's under the SOL with those given numbers?
Well,
I don't believe that they don't give enough information for that. The correct answer is yes, but I just don't see where the numbers add up so you can figure out if it's over the SOL or if it's under the MVA.
Well, yeah, and that's just what I was looking at is, they give this in megawatts. They told us that this generator's basically putting out 252 megabars. I just don't know how that's going to distribute on these lines unless I did some calculations, which is going to be way, way, way outside the scope of the NERC exam. Could I make some assumptions if that 230 kV held true for all of these bus voltages? It doesn't line up with the fact that this is at 230 kV. And if that's at 230 kV, you should not have any reactive power flow at all, because reactive power flow is driven by voltage differences. So yeah, that doesn't line up. You could come up with an estimate or a calculation on the relative impedance of these lines and try to divvy up that amount of megabar flow on those. And then if you come up with an estimate on the megavar flow that would be on this line, then you could calculate MVA. Again, that's well outside the scope of the NERC exam. You're not going to see anything close to that. What I will say is that I have seen NERC exam questions where they simply maybe should have labeled that as MVA, but just didn't. They labeled it as megawatts instead of MVA, or that should have been in megawatts, but they just had MVA up there. So from a NERC exam perspective, I would not concern myself with this particular question at all. You're not going to see anything remotely close to that. I'm just looking through comments here. Yeah, Andrew, yeah, a public appeal to increase load. Can you give me an example when you would trip a unit purposefully? Yes. I can give you an example of a time when I came really close to doing that. It was a early morning event, and we were dealing with this. Basically, that scenario is actually earlier than that, but basically we had more generation than we did load, and was dealing with that. Had pretty much everything regulated down that we could, and had a plant operator that did not want to comply with an operating instruction. And they were ramping up because they were having some issues at the plant. And essentially the unit was probably going to trip if they didn't ramp up. And we were really, really close to just tripping the high side breaker and tripping that unit offline. I mean, if you get to that point where you've got everything dispatched to minimums that you can, and load continues to drop, and your ACE is going high and frequency is going, or your ACE is going really positive, frequency is going high, yeah, you've got to do something. And if it gets to that point, then yeah, you're going to have to take a generator offline. And in most cases, that would just be a dispatch. You just dispatch somebody to go to zero. They didn't comply, then in most cases, from a transmission standpoint, we've usually got access to their high side breakers, and we would just disconnect them from the system in that case. Not ever happened, but it could. Okay, so let me copy this one. Okay, so there's load down here at Dawn and Sunset stations. Contingency analysis for the next day shows that if line alpha was lost, line Bravo would be at 850. Transformer would be at 510. What would be your operating plan? Let's look at the transformer first. Transformer be loaded up to 510 MVA. Transformer has 700 and 750 MVA for normal and emergency ratings. So transformer's in good shape. So don't have to worry about it. Line Bravo would be at 850. So here's line Bravo. We're going to be at 850. So yeah, we're going to be loaded up well above even load shed. So what would be your operating plan? And in this case, if line alpha tripped, looking at our options, if we take line B from service, that's basically we're going to drop these loads. Don't want to do that. Lower generation at twilight. Well, when you see this configuration, if line alpha trips, guess what? Line Bravo becomes a radial feed. It's the only thing feeding these loads is line Bravo. The only way you're going to adjust flows on that line, if it's a radial feed, is you're going to have to shed some load from Dawn station. Okay, so here's Dawn down here. You're going to have to shed loads. That's the reason why that's the correct answer, short version of it. Lowering generation at twilight, changing this generation here is not going to do anything to affect the flow on that line. And raise generation at sunset, same thing. Whatever you want to with that generation, it's not going to impact the flow on that line. The only thing that's going to impact it is you're going to have to shed load here at Dawn station to adjust the flow on that line. If it's a radial feed, that's the only thing you can do. Does everybody understand why that's the case? Why, if it's a radial feed, that's the only way you're going to, you've got to shed load. I mean, there's And Heather, I'm looking here, or can you give an example? Is there an example of regular scheduled preventative maintenance for substation workforce? Absolutely. There's tons of regularly scheduled preventative maintenance activities for substations. Oh gosh, everything from routine breaker maintenance, breakers have a schedule, routine schedules, maintenance on those. Not so much now as years past because we're replacing a lot of the old OCBs with like SF6 breakers, which have an incredibly long maintenance interval before you have to do maintenance on them. But even then, there's still routine stuff, for inspections, checking gas pressures. You may want to have a routine outage like on SF6 breaker for no other reason than to go in and clean the bushings off. If it's in a
Yeah,
real,
I didn't ask that question, Kelly. I think someone was trying to answer my question. I don't know.
oh, okay. Yeah, this is an example of regular scheduled preventive maintenance. Okay. Let's see. I didn't see it become a radial. That does help. Thanks. Okay. Any other questions for today? We're wrapping up just a little bit earlier than usual. Jamie had a question. Can you review how to tell which transmission lines have the most sag? Not sure exactly how to address that. Are you talking about which transmission lines in terms of review how to tell which transmission lines have the most sag? What do you remember what the answer options you had to consider? Because I'm trying to categorize that as far as in terms of MVA loading or in terms of voltage levels, like is a 500 kV line going to have more sag than a 161? I think I may know what you're referring to, though, is I have seen that NERC exam question where they ask about loading and they give you like answer A with maybe 20 megavar and 90 megawatts. Maybe answer option B was 90 megawatts and 20 megavars. And Charlie was maybe 100 megawatts and 0 megavars. And Delta, and I'm just making these up, maybe 50 megawatts and 50 megavars. It looks something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in that case, you just basically calculate MVA based off of megawatts and megavars. And you would just calculate based off of that. So A squared plus B squared equals C squared, it's Pythagoras theorem. And then this case, I'm pretty sure that one's going to be the correct answer. So to verify that, let's just do 90 x squared plus 20 x squared equals that. You take the square root, and yeah, it just winds up being about 92 megavar or MVA, sorry. So that one would be about 92 MVA. This one would be 92 MVA. This one's going to be 100 MVA. And 50 squared plus 50 squared. Let's see what that turns out to be. 50 x squared plus 50 x squared equals that. Take the square root, and it winds up being about 70. So which one of those would have the most sag? It's going to be that one because it's got the most MVA. Yeah, I do remember seeing that particular question. I don't remember if those were the exact numbers, but that's how you would calculate it. Any other questions for today? Not. If anybody's taking their exam within the next week, best wishes on that. Andy and I both always appreciate feedback. Let us know how you did either way. Especially if you see any surprises on the exam, things that you weren't expecting to see, let us know about those and we can add them to our materials. Helps us make the material better. Other than that, if you are taking your exam the next week, like I said, best wishes. If not, hopefully we'll see y'all back here next Friday. Andy or myself, one will be here next Friday. And have a great evening and a great weekend coming up.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you again.
Yep.
Thank you.
Whoa. Help darken it. Then I help darken it so you can see. I go get Matilda my phone because Melissa wants to talk to her. Okay. I don't see why we should take an hour. Give me.